Welcome to 501 Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and coming up this week, friend of the podcast and friend of myself, Tyler Savage is back, and we're discussing two legendary screenplay adaptations of the James Dickey novel To the White Sea. First by David and Janet Peoples, the second by the Coen Brothers. But first off, what I watched this week. I finally caught her up to Smooth Talk, which was released on Criterion back in February after a big restoration in I guess this movie won the Sundance Award back in 1985 before the big Sundance revival. It's directed by Joyce Chopra, and it's also has a musical director, James Taylor, from last week's episode on Two Lane Blacktop. Real quickly, correction. I think last week I said Two Lane Blacktop was James Taylor's only acting role. I believe it's his only lead performance. He's done another bit parts, often playing himself, most notably in Funny People. But this has this amazing early performance by Laura Dern in it, and it's based off the Joyce Carol Oates short story, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, which is what her most famous or most anthologized short story. And if you haven't seen this, I'm going to try to keep to my spoilers vague as I can, because this involves the ending, and I'll keep it vague. The short story has a very famous ending, and knowing that ending, I wasn't familiar. I knew what the ending was. I read the short story after seeing the movie, and the movie it does a really interesting job of fleshing out the family and the other characters. But the main moment is the end, and it involves Treat Williams. And I gotta say, because I was assuming that the movie was going to end the short story's ending, Treat Williams has one of the most amazing performances of his career I'd ever seen. I can't believe no one ever, everyone always talks Prince of the City, but no one ever talks of this. So there's a tension because you're expecting the short story ending, and the movie does include technically the short story's ending. It goes into it's an 80s ending. I'll say that much. And I'm kind of weirded out because it doesn't feel like the movie necessarily lost its nerve just because the scenes with Treat Williams had that much tension to it. So I mean, did the movie have its cake and eat it too? Apologize if I wasn't subtle enough and this was a bad spoilers to opening. But one of my more interesting reads of the week was I got through Rachel Kushner's new essay collection, The Hard Crowd, and it contains a bunch of movie stuff. If you're familiar with any of her novels, The Flamethrower has this ongoing, I don't know if you call it plot line, but the movie, Barbara Loden's movie Wanda, makes an appearance in the novel, and this would be before, as far as I know, Wanda had regained its more recent revival before, it was put out on Criterion, or before You Must Remember This did the episode on it. It might have even been out of print. And she does this trick in Flamethrowers where she keeps mentioning seeing Wanda without describing that you're seeing Wanda. So it's this unnamed movie. And in this essay collection, amongst other film references, there's a lot of Godard in it. There's an essay on the French writer Marguerite Duras, novelist and playwright, but who most famously in film wrote Hiroshima Manamore. And this is relevant for this week because late in the conversation with me and Tyler, we start to get into the concept of the screenplay format and what it's good for. And I was thinking about what I had read of Marguerite Duras's screenplay for Hiroshima Manamore, and I want to read a part of her preface. Readers should not be surprised that Alan René's pictorial contribution is practically never described in this work. My role is limited to describing these elements from which René made his films. And then later in the preface, as I hand the book over for publication, I greatly regret that it does not include the account of the almost daily conversations between René and myself, G. Jarlot and myself, and all three of us together. Now, that the published version of the screenplay does contain dialogue, but it's not strictly like one of those completely prose style screenplays, but Hiroshima Manamore is an innovatively famous editorial movie, nonlinear editorial movie, and if you've ever tried to see a nonlinear movie in normal screenplay format, it's pretty incoherent. It's really hard to read. And part of the conversation Tyler and I start to go down a little is this idea that to do something really cinematic, I just flat out say in the conversation, I fucking hate the normal screenplay format. And part of the reason I just hate this format is I think it's a large source of as to why film has too many linear elements of the stage, and all too frequently, for my taste, doesn't embrace the intrinsic attributes it has by itself. Like aspects like the editorial minded, which obviously are going to interest me, but also keep it ungrounded from physicality and time. The reason movies are so TV on the radio, where actors are just telling you what you're seeing or telling you what to think from what a writer has written to them, and they always work on one level. They don't seem to really truly engage the senses. The current format really sets you up for this. Now, if you've read Mark Norman's book on the history of screenwriting, What Happens Next, the format was primarily invented by Thomas Inch, who was in competition with D.W. Griffith. It's not artistic competition, but financial competition. The book attributes him with the creation of the studio assembly line. The 1 page equals 1 minute screen time ratio, and the idea that a story has to be imagined totally and planned out before filming. And Tyler and I kind of discuss some modern directors who are notable for bucking the screenplay format. Ones we didn't discuss, but the major ones right now would be someone like Wong Kar-wai. But also recently this week, for some reason, I jumped back in. I rewatched Roma, which I think for parts of it was done without a script. And whenever there's no script, it's inherently going to favor the director. And it's also going to be really expensive, which was why Inch made a name with the format and saved money on the format. But when we look at directors who do something sometimes intrinsically cinematic stuff, I personally sometimes see the level of early cinema or silent cinema coming from them. And I think that this script format, using a format that's something just like, prose or just a synopsis or something that's not interior exterior actors lines, and you're discouraged from having too much description, and also don't describe exactly a editorial pattern or any type of filmic pattern, things like that. It seems like it's more for the financier and the agents and not for the actual betterment blueprint. And it is what it is. It's show business, it's a business, and I hate that argument, but whatever. It still applies. Anyway, we're discussing an adaptation of James Dickey, his final novel, a very cinematic novel that made two very cinematic screenplays. And many people, including Roger Deakins, recently declared that the Coen Brothers' To the WWII was their best script. And it's not a stretch to say it would have made one of their best movies. And it was going to be one of the most expensive movies, but it also is probably never going to get made. And this is a movie that goes long, or their version especially goes long swaths without dialogue. And my personal theory is that is the reason why this movie, a big part of the reason why this movie will never see the light of the day. So you gotta figure, if the format's depriving us of what could be the best Coen Brothers movie, maybe we should rethink the omnipresence of the format, or the fact that going outside the format is so rarely accepted. And with that, here's me and Tyler discussing the two adaptations of To the WWII by David and Janet Peoples and Ethan and Joel Coen.
Well, dude, thank you for sending these over. I mean, this is... I know a little bit about Dickey, obviously, but and I'd heard about this script because of the Coens, because I think that I'd heard about it vaguely as this almost dialogue empty script of theirs that they had been trying to make. But beyond that, right. I really didn't know much about it. And what a crazy fucking wild ass story. And it's so harrowing, and it's pure, survival man mode.
So jumping in, what was your order? What order did you read them in?
My order was the People's version first, and then the Coen version.
I did the same. I thought basically, well, all things being equal, I don't know if I wanted to read the novel first because I wanted to like
I read maybe like a quarter of it or like a fifth of it. Like I did read maybe the first 30 or 40 pages because I just wanted to get a sense of how verbatim.
You read way more than I did. I skipped around.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of did. Like this morning, that was actually part of the reason I said, well, give me another 15 minutes, as I kind of wanted to just read a few more pages, just to get a sense, because there was some very significant differences. And also, I think one part of our talk, too, that we should make time for is just the formatting of these two scripts is very, very interesting.
I got a feeling it's not just going to be a part of the talk. I feel like it's going to be...
It might be the centerpiece of it, yeah.
Okay, you read the David and Janet Peoples. Like he wrote David Peoples as a career. He wrote. I first came across him just because of Blade Runner, and most famously he got some cachet for writing Unforgiven.
Yep.
Which was supposedly like this big one of his first scripts he wrote when he came to L.A. in '76, and Eastwood pulled it off a pile from our other episode talking about stories about Eastwood pulling random scripts off a pile. And then after that point, I guess he was still in demand, and I'm not sure where the delineation comes between him writing scripts by himself and with his wife, but he wrote 12 Monkeys with his wife, and this he wrote with his wife.
Was 12 Monkeys an adaptation too?
Yeah, it's Le Jetée. It's the Chris Marker movie, but it's also this weird thing where, like, in theory, it follows the story of Le Jetée, but like, it has a vibe of an original just because you take the idea that a person from the future trying to save the future by going to the past and correcting something witnesses his own death. Like, they take that and then run with it and make Terry Gilliam do stuff with it. But this, I think what's fascinating is To the White Sea came out in '93, so this would have followed the whole normal, like, hot book, maybe you give a year or two, but this is like a hot book. Let's get someone to adapt it. And this is like the first adaptation that comes out from the book pretty soon after it was published, relatively. It's 3 years after it was published.
Right, yeah. So they were 96 and then the Coens was 98. That was also interesting seeing, just seeing that timeline.
Well, did you compare, the other point I thought of, did you try to figure out where Saving Private Ryan came in between before and after these adaptations?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think about it so much in terms of specifically the before and after, but I was like, yeah, this timeline is very clear. I mean, also it was interesting because last time we spoke, we were talking about kind of early 90s cinema and like how many things were changing at that period. So I think that a big part of it was probably how much of an appetite is there for this type of story, because in a weird way, this is a little bit more of a throwback. It might have been easier to make this movie in the late 80s, early 90s. Like maybe there was something about it that was slightly past, because this kind of and I love it, but there's something about him. He is almost like more of a 70s or 80s kind of strong silent type movie icon than maybe he is something that was suited for the late 90s. I don't know. And now, I mean, I think it would be hard to get this movie made now because we're in it'd be impossible.
Oh my God. Well, so this movie is still in development. It's bought by Warner Brothers. Are you familiar with Vertigo and Roy Lee?
Yeah, I know Roy Lee. I mean, I know of him, yeah.
They're the ones that have this in development, and they're scrapping everything. But I mean, and based on his other movies, which, I mean, we're talking about things like he did the current iteration of Stephen King's It. I mean, he's got a weird list. I think it's that weird mingling of the studios where I'm not sure he's got an EP credit on Godzilla versus Kong. He's on the Lego movies, a Stand miniseries, but it goes all the way back to The Grudge, and I don't know. Okay, well, the fascinating thing is, I, in particular, especially in this very, very current climate, would want to know what Asian Americans think about this movie being released right now.
Well, right, exactly. I mean, I was just going to say, with the anti-Asian sentiment issues we've been dealing with and the horrifying things we've been hearing about happening publicly, I mean, I think this would be almost an irresponsible,
Well, just also the
yeah.
just the general appetite for a movie about World War II and the Pacific Campaign in general. Like, it's not even like this. The story happened.
Yeah, regardless of this story in particular, but even making anything about the Pacific theater of World War II right now would be tricky. And I was like, in the People's version, I literally had like a little tally I was going through. There's about, I think, 12 to 14 close quarter murders of Japanese people, and some of them are children, some of them are women.
Yeah,
some of them some of them are elderly, some of them are handicapped, some of them are handicapped elderly people. Like he's really going for it to this.
How much of this do you think is him like jumping off of like everyone might have been telling him that he's just had his Oscar success, although his Oscar success is now 4 years in the past, but off a very revisionist, violent. How much of them is telling him like you're our violence guy, you're our hard ass?
I think you're totally right. I mean, I think there is like this kind of harsh machismo like thing to this where it's almost like, and that's what I meant about the period where this might have been an easier movie to get made in the late 80s or right at the beginning of the 90s, because I think sentiments just kind of changed a little bit. There's almost a little bit of Rambo in here. I mean, there's just like this one isolated tough guy doing surviving by any means necessary. And obviously, all the background of him in Alaska and his upbringing and his connection to nature and animal life make it something more than just, a pure war story. There's something about that that's really interesting. But I do wonder if maybe that kind of, the era of that type of male hero might have been kind of closing by the time they were trying to develop this movie.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Rambo. Rambo's, I think, a really astute observation. I was thinking of more into the, we'll get into the Coen stuff later, but this, I don't know how to describe it, this philosophical idea of man still being an animal, being involved with nature and inherently a killer. And so I kept thinking of poetic interpretations of that, like Cormac McCarthy, which is going to be a big part of the Coen Brothers. And, but also like, Dickey, like, okay, we should go into some of the James Dickey, which you said you sounded familiar with him. I own his 3 novels, but I am wholly unfamiliar with him. I read some of To the White Sea. What I find fascinating is he comes from a great tradition I love of prose novelists who came from poetry, but he mainly made his name as a poetry. He was the 1966 U.S. Poet Laureate. I
saw that when I looked it up. And then he was also a poetry professor as well, right?
Oh, yeah. He taught at a lot of different places, but like I watched this really cool YouTube video of him doing a poem he wrote for Life magazine for the moon landing that ABC News then redid, which was intense. And this was 3 years before his first big novel success, which was, it helps out cinematically, Deliverance.
Yeah.
And his second novel, I have trouble pronouncing, and he only wrote 3 novels. To the White Sea is the third one. He also did the poem at Jimmy Carter's inauguration.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, too. He also drank himself to death, which... is sad, but somehow fitting, for a guy who spends his career writing about this, sort of men in isolation and these incredibly like harsh kind of things. And, I mean, with both Deliverance, and it's interesting too, and why David Webb Peoples might have been it. There's a bit of an overlap with Unforgiven there, with the David Webb Peoples of it all, in terms of like men being an island and holding in all of these, all of these struggles and things, and never saying it, and sort of like, I'm William Money, the women of, the killer of women and children, but today I'm here to kill you, Sheriff Bob, or whatever the hell it is. Like that, there's something about violence being a necessary part of a man's life and a component that is somehow tied in him because of our evolution, our connection to nature. And it's about making people so that's where I think maybe he was very logical, or him and his wife were very logical writers to hire for this.
What Janet Peoples would have brought to this, a story about like men keeping quiet and then making it more violent. That's an interesting take too.
Well, it's kind of a meditation on violence. I mean, then you think also of how depraved Deliverance gets. And like you said,
Right.
there was probably a bit of a thing after the success of Deliverance being like, oh, well, I'm going to continue down this path of, writing quite difficult stories.
Yeah, for Dickey, similar to the way People's would have been. One weird thought I had was more in the People's version, definitely than the Coen's brother, just because there's this, especially in the People's version. Which, by the way, do we need to do a plot synopsis of this? Like,
I mean, we can. I mean, it's very. I mean, it's pretty simple.
it's
I
a
mean,
very simple setup. Very simple setup.
Yeah, so okay, so it's Pacific Theater, late in World War II. We meet a gunner for the Air Force named Muldrow, and they're going out on one of their final missions before the bombing of Tokyo and what's going to be sort of the end of the Pacific Theater. And there is the plane is attacked and it goes down. He's got a parachute out of it, and the majority of the movie is spent with him trying to reach a secluded island, basically in Japan, as part of an attempt to get back to the U.S. And so he's from Alaska,
yeah,
and he's
from
trying
Alaska.
to get from this island in Japan to Alaska. But the vast majority of the story is spent in true survival mode as he's crossing Japan on his way, trying to get home, basically.
One of the weird antecedents I thought of, mainly in the People's version, I don't know if this is in the book, but there's this idea presented from his history in Alaska that like he was violent before the war, and I thought of the comic book creator Garth Ennis, who's really popular right now because he's the creator of The Boys, and his run on The Punisher, which is also another infamously popular character right now for a lot of the Blue Lives Matters are pushing.
Sure.
Garth Ennis treated Frank Castle, the Punisher character. His run is to me the definitive Punisher run, and one of the fundamental things he did was the Punisher's origin story was he's a Vietnam vet who came home and his family was killed by mobsters, and then he decided he was going to start killing criminals, and he was an anti-hero in Marvel Comics. Garth Ennis' take on it was that this man was a psychotic killer before he got to Vietnam. Then when he got to Vietnam, he did well in Vietnam. And then when he went home, he was still a psychotic killer who just suddenly doesn't have a venue to kill people anymore. And when his family's killed, he suddenly has a quote unquote revenge excuse to kill people more again. And Muldrow kind of reminds me of that, where like he was a killer before the war and the war just gave him venue for this.
Absolutely. It almost, I mean, that's such like a fun trope, right? I mean, that, people that are displaced after and kind of, also what I liked in it, to me, it was more present in the People's version than in the Coen's version, is his relationship with his father as that guy, as him kind of being, and his father being a hunter and kind of, the mystery of what happened in the father's life. But again, this idea that there's this inherent violence that we're capable of. And just to riff on that for 2 seconds, I think that we still have that in our movie culture and in our, all around us, like you're referencing The Punisher. Mm-hmm. Like, look at John Wick, or I just went and saw Nobody, right? But it's been turned into this more cartoony kind of, killing goons and Russians and evil Chinese and, different types of international gangsters. It's been taken out of the realm of, really something like this where, I mean, Christ, in the Coen Brothers version, he's slitting a dog open from navel to neck in the first 10 minutes of the movie. Like, I mean, it's very much about the grounded violence of survival and living as an animal. You know what I mean? Or living amongst, living in nature as just another animal as part of the ecosystem.
I'm as keen to talk about the possibility that humanity, like I still like to think of us as dumb animals in general, but in terms of violence, like I like to differentiate between what we personally in our day-to-day do with violence versus what we see in movie violence. And movie violence there's something about violence that's so inherently cinematic that like there's a reason it's perpetuated on screen more than our real lives. And violence in our real lives tend to be like exaggerated, rare, but at the same time, like
and slower too, like when violence happens in real life, it feels like it's this kind of very shocking thing versus the way that we relate to it in film is made to be sexy and appealing and have rhythm to it. And I was just watching I finally caught up on Craig Zoller's last couple movies, Attack on Brawl on Cell Block 99 and Dragged Across Concrete. And I'm like, I fucking love this way of doing violence, because what it is it's like, no, that punch really hurt. No, when you stab me in my gut, I'm going to be wounded. I'm not going to hit you with a roundhouse kick and fly up onto the ceiling and go over your head. It's like you actually feel the impact of the violence in the people's bodies.
It's very distinctly unpleasant on purpose.
Yes.
I want to go. You mentioned format. Let's start to dive into the difference between the formats. There's something. Well, for on a basic level, you mentioned earlier the Coens famously, this is their script that was mostly a silent movie or a movie without giant chunks of dialogue. And I was kind of surprised at how much, based on, I guess, off the book, which you read more of, they just naturally had to not have long sections without dialogue, just because he's silently going through Japan, north through Japan. And, but at the same time, the People's script, okay, one basic thing I found fascinating, and I'm curious what you think of it in a format situation, exclamation marks. There's so many exclamation marks in the People's version.
Yes, and it's funny, too, because a lot of them are also reserved for just saying, it's Muldrow! Exclamation point. You know what I mean? Like where he's like pretending to be, he's pretending to be a Japanese person, hiding in different ways, disguising himself. And there is a lot of like, what's that object hidden in the snow? It's Muldrow. But it's fun, too. I mean, I think that the thing is also, in addition to the exclamations, there's a tremendous amount of caps. There's a lot of caps throughout everything. And I actually really, because I've read Unforgiven and Blade Runner, and I like I really just like his style. I think it's cool. I think it's unique. And I think it's inherently visual the way he writes, but yet he doesn't do a lot of camera direction per se. He's very descriptive of images, but it's like less traditional camera direction.
I guess. I mean, well, for starters, Peoples is obviously an amazing screenwriter who got most of his scripts made, which is to a lot of screenwriters is the ultimate test of whether you're a good screenwriter or not. But especially coming out 12 Monkeys, he had the feeling that this is probably going to get made. And what I found fascinating, there was a ton of angle-ons.
Yes,
there were a lot of those, but I mean, I agree with you. He was very visual, very pithy, but I think the unfortunate thing is when you compare and contrast David Peoples, who still was a really hard-ass screenwriter of integrity, to the Coen Brothers, and you see an unmade Coen Brothers movie, it's going to lack in comparison, even though it's still an impressive script, even as an adaptation of a great novel. I assume a great novel.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I agree and disagree, because I mean, I do think that there is stuff in the People's version that I kind of preferred, that I did like. I mean,
what kind of stuff? I had one specific one, but I want to hear more.
Well, yeah, I think for me the thing is like even in the first. Really in the setup, like everything going up through the crash of the plane, they do he and his the People script does a lot more of weaving in who Muldrow is and his experiences in Alaska.
The flashbacks. He's more heavy on the flashbacks.
He's much more heavy on the flashbacks, and it's cool. Like, what I love in the Coens thing, though, right, is that it starts, the very first image is with something that's obscure coming at us at camera, and then we realize it's a bird, and then the bird passes screen as the B-29 bomber comes into view or whatever. So it was this very nice way of they're like, we're nodding to nature, we're going to nod to the hawk and that element that's going to come in later, but we're not going to do a big flashback.
I think in both scripts, the last image is a bird too, against the line.
Exactly, that's what I mean. Yeah, the hawk is. I mean, basically, I think the end of the end of the story is, I mean, essentially him dying, and being gunned down by Japanese soldiers. In the People's version, he's getting gunned down. In the Coens version, he's getting stabbed. He's getting killed with a samurai sword, essentially. But in both versions, you get the sense that his spirit is sort of lifting off through this hawk that is flying through the snow over them as this moment's happening, which I think is wonderful and beautiful. But also I liked, I guess I liked that a little bit more throughout. in the People's version, where there was like this sense of his connection to how he would have a lot of these skill sets and why he is almost very comfortable in this horrible situation that he's in. You know, he's built for it. You know. But overall, I agree. I mean, I think with the Coens thing, there is, there's just more of a feeling for the world of the movie. It's a little less dry. The People's version can be a little bit it's descriptive and it's moment to moment, but it doesn't have as clear of a point of view.
Well, one other practical thing that I think is a common thing with most screenwriters have to deal with that the Coens don't, or very rarely do they not have to deal with, is Peoples is writing for someone else to direct. The Coens are writing for themselves to direct.
Exactly. And you can feel that. You can feel that difference because there is such a clear vision in the Coens version that but in a way, as part of just like a writing exercise, I really enjoyed both. And back to the formatting of it all, they both did so many things that I was just intrigued by and might steal.
Do you have what any examples you want to mention, or do you want to keep these in shop?
No, I mean, no, I love like in the Coens version, for example, I love how once they establish a voice, they'll carry it through without even using the slug of the character anymore.
Oh, that's a funny one. I tried that a few years ago, and it's like, because what I tried to do...
It'll backfire. It could backfire.
Oh, yeah. It backfired quickly. And the thing is, like, I even tried to be helpful where I think I noticed they did was they put the character slug, and then they'd stop giving the character slug at the voice. They mainly did it with voiceover. But what I would do was I would just, because you save a line. And so I would put it at the top of every page whenever, if it goes over a page turn, you then put the slug in at the top of the page. Still not, it still hurt. Still.
Yeah, it's also weird too. I mean, both of these scripts, like we were saying at the beginning of this, are very, very action heavy. So there'll be these stretches of 10, 12 pages where there's not a single line of dialogue. And it's interesting to see. I don't know. I mean, really, both of them are very imagistically written scripts.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to be. I think that the Coens is probably a little less dense of a read, but they're both pretty dense. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
I should go into my history right now and admit that I actually finished I was first came aware of the Coens draft, and it's been available for going on, like, I don't know, the 15, 17 years. It's been available for a while. I've had it forever. Sure. I just finished reading it for the first time today.
Nice. I did too. I mean, I caught up on most of it, but that's why I needed the extra 15 minutes. I was reading the end.
Years ago, I tried reading it, and I was told it was really popular in the Ain't It Cool circles. And there was that period where it was going to get made. It was going to. Oh, but with Mulder, did you hear? Do you hear Brad Pitt's voice throughout this? Because that's who the Coens cast in him.
I didn't, but that makes perfect sense. I mean,
that's who they cast
in the timeline. Yeah.
Yeah, this script, the Coens version recently was mentioned on Roger Deakins, or Team Deakins, Roger and James Deakins podcast, as he thinks it's the best Coen Brothers script. And the Coens have pretty much abandoned it because it was supposed to be their movie after Big Lebowski, before Oh Brother, I think.
Imagine that. Yeah, that would be wild.
It was going to be an $80 million movie then.
Yeah.
And like the quote they have is, "Don't set a movie in Tokyo during the firebombing unless you have lots of money for that." And they feel bad because, like, supposedly Brad Pitt keeps bringing it up to them, and like they're not going to make it. I knew this was an amazing script, but then when you get to this description without dialogue, it's just hard to put in your head cinematically what's there's just a more. It's not like you're reading pages and pages of prose description. And to be fair, prose description can sometimes be that hard. But like with screenwriting, you just find yourself going through these long stretches. Like, wait, where am I visually, cinemageographically? What's happening here? What was that key moment there? Especially because movies scripts are written so tightly visually, like, because they're trying to compress space, they're trying to get across a lot of visual information. Screenwriting format is supposed to give you that feel of what a movie is like as it doles out information. You don't want to be too detailed, but at the same time, the format itself is just constantly lends itself to like this superficial read. Screenplays are read by people who don't like reading typically, and
Yes, agreed.
I mean, so what ended up happening was I started this journey where like I started reading a bunch more Coen Brothers screenplays after I'd watched the movie. Like the main one I did that was a great read was Miller's Crossing, which I watched Miller's Crossing and then reread that, and it was immaculate. And then like 2 or 3 years later, after my attempts at reading this, No Country for Old Men comes out, and that seems to be the closest that a distillation of what they would have done with To the White Sea, where like you have these very procedural sequences of how a character does something to get from point A to point B with doing something. You think of things like Llewellyn when he first discovers the drugs, or whenever he's trying to hide the suitcase in the hotel stuff. And you think of like, it's a very quiet, dialogue-free scene of a character doing something that's very intensely fun to watch on screen, but when you describe it, it's probably easy to be glaze over and bored. Like, I don't know what's happening there.
No, but you're right. Like the Llewellyn, especially that opening, the introduction to Llewellyn and him discovering the massacre and the drugs. I mean, like that. I agree. And even when I was reading this, I was like, oh, they never made this because they made No Country for Old Men.
You did distinctly have that.
I very much had that thought, because it's also, and also, No Country's so notorious for having almost zero music in it, other than that, like, rumble after Llewellyn gets killed. I think there's like a rumble sound or something that comes in, but literally there's no score, like, from the vast majority.
I just recently, there was I've been a big lover of the Team Deacons podcast, and they talked about, apparently there's a bunch of cues in the movie, but the thing they said specifically was, they told Carter Burwell, the Coens did, was you have to go in from wind and come out into wind.
Right. Yeah. So whenever they're in there, they're so subtle, and they're just these little subtle accents. But yeah, and there is also, again, obviously, like the Cormac reference, even to like Dickey, there is a lot of like, tough men going it alone. You know what I mean? Like they're already, and obviously once Llewellyn has to kind of leave his wife in a failed attempt to try to save her, it's very much kind of this man on the run kind of thing, which obviously isn't the same as, 1945, Japan, but there is some comparison to be made between those two. And I feel like whatever they were after creatively, that itch got somewhat scratched doing the McCarthy adaptation, if they weren't able to do the $100 million World War II movie.
Yeah. I think one key difference for me between the two scripts is this. There's something about the Coen Brothers. You feel like you're watching a Coen Brothers movie. You get their worldview, you get the violence, you get the absurdity, all this stuff. But whenever you read the People's version, you get someone who's trying to adapt a very poetic, hard-ass book and making it cinematic. And People's relies on... There seems like there's a lot of, this isn't the best term for it, but something along the lines of reversals, like where it's like you have to cinematically set something. This is what we think is going to happen, and Mulder stays in the crane quiet for a day, which that was one other significant change between the two versions,
right?
But, I wanted to ask you, I've been thinking a lot about this in screenwriting, this reversals being this idea that you set an audience expectation up and then you take it away from them. Are you familiar with this Shane Black thing he calls the haystack game?
No. What's that? What's he call it?
Okay, there's a version of it that actually played out in Iron Man 3, but I'm not going to give you the exact quote, but the idea is like Shane Black talks about this way of like you constantly have reversals. So you say a guy falls off a plane, the audience says, oh no, that's bad. And the filmmaker says, no, that's good because he had a parachute. Then the audience says, well, that's good. And then the filmmaker says, no, that's bad because the parachute didn't open. The audience then goes, oh no, that's terrible. And then the filmmaker says, no, it's okay because he had a reserve chute. Oh, no, that's good. The reserve chute didn't open either. Oh, no, that's bad. No, it's okay because he sees a haystack right underneath. Oh, no, that's good. No, because there's a pitchfork. And then he comes out of the haystack.
That's
like,
why
oh,
it's the
good.
haystack.
And then he misses the haystack. Yeah.
No, that's it. And you're right. This whole movie, in a way, is an exercise in that. Like this entire because, and then Muldrow, sorry to ruin it, doesn't make it out of this movie. But he dies closer to home than he ever thought he would be. You know what I mean? And kind of has this peace with the ancient man that he lives with.
Is that the success of the movie? Because I remember thinking structurally this movie just tends to have like a generalized, like, I wouldn't call it a problem, but it's just something that's notable that like most of the tension in this movie is about him like not getting killed, and he gets closer to his destination and then gets killed. Like
Exactly. I mean, that's where I feel like there is this, again, the meditation on the violence, and there's something that's hard to articulate but is in there, like with the dad, with his father, like in the People's version, right? I can't remember, like in the People's, it's really not clear why the father moved them to Alaska and had this life. You know what I mean? And there is something about the being solitary, and you almost got the sense that Muldrow would have been happy to just die with that ancient man in Japan without ever making it back to Alaska. So there is something about...
Well, I was going to say he would have been happy to stay in Alaska his whole life. Did you see anything in the book that explain anything more detail on the father?
No, I didn't get to anything that got me any more detail on the father. And I have a feeling that they don't give you that answer in the book either. Because I think that there's something about that. It is like... strong silent type's not the right thing. But, somebody, again, like men who were islands of solitude and secret, and you're never going to quite penetrate what's going on with them. Like that's again the Llewellyn comparison to in No Country, right? You don't get anything on his backstory. We don't understand why he has any skill set that he has. We don't get he's just a man on a mission.
Isn't he a Vietnam vet?
He's a vet. Yeah, you get that nod that he's a vet, but you just know tremendously little about him, is what I'm saying. But it's very much, I don't know. He's an archetype.
No. The one thing I missed from the People's Draft that I don't remember in the Coen Brothers draft was the American Buddhist monk.
That was great. I mean, I thought that was, and also in the People's Draft, it's handled quite efficiently. He's brought into this monastery. He's kind of made to feel very comfortable, and then immediately he's getting the shit kicked out of him by Japanese soldiers. And there's also like again, that's back to your haystack thing, right? It's like, oh my God, he landed at a monastery and there's Americans here. He's going to be fine. And that doesn't end up being the case, and it's actually when he's with the old Japanese man at the end that he's the most safe. So I don't know. It was, I that is a beat that I missed and I really loved in the People's version.
Yeah, I mean, like I know the Coens are growing tight, but like it feels like they could have run with it.
I mean, that's one thing to note too. I mean, right? There's like the Coens version is almost 20 pages shorter, I think, or something, 15 pages shorter than the People's version too.
Yeah,
and yet it has, to your point about like we were talking about why it's probably the better of the two versions because it's got a more clear vision and point of view. It's also got a lot more of the dialogue from the book in it, which is interesting. It's got like more of these big chunks of like 2 pages of this colonel's monologue or whatever, and where you get some of that in the People's version. In the Coen version, they'll literally let a lot of that stuff just live as it was in the original text.
Well, you know what I found fascinating in both instances where you have like the earlier stuff with the redhead guy who's having his first flight and his friend. I think there was 1 or 2 instances. I did read the first few pages of the book, like the way Dickey, being a poet, he occasionally he'll go ahead and give you his quotation dialogue, and sometimes he'll just say, "I said this." And some of the weakest dialogue I was seeing in the scripts, of both versions of the script, were stuff where Dickey didn't write out that dialogue. He just said, and then I said, like, well, when Mulder, like, when they go on the first flight, the flight that they get shot down, he shoots down a plane and he brags about it afterwards. And that always seemed like an odd way for him to act. But in the book, he just kind of casually says, like, in a line that's not quoted out, he's just like, I talked to the captain. The captain said, "Get off the horn." Like, and it's a line in the prose.
That's very interesting. Yeah, because you're right in both of these versions, but even more in the Cohen one, it almost reads like a Top Gun line. It's almost like, haha,
Yeah.
you see that Cap, and it's kind of like him being like this cocky pilot or something, and you're like, that who this guy is? But also, that's a good scene to look at between the two of them, right? Because both scripts have that exact scene with the redhead and the asshole guy that's trying to get into a fight with Muldrow.
Yeah.
And it's a very quintessential, let me show you that I'm tougher guy. He's supposed to be shorter than this other guy, and he shows that he's stronger by doing this like knuckle grip thing. And it really is like a dick measuring contest moment at the beginning of the movie to let you know, no, this guy's tougher than everybody else. And there's not any irony to it. He actually is, and he's been forged in the cold sort of Alaska in a way that no other man can meet his toughness.
I thought at the very least it needed to plant how strong he was and how much he's going to need to survive all the shit he's going to. But to your point, that I think they could do both. You mentioned us going to format, and that is a lot of what my notes are. I want to get into your philosophies on screenwriting format and why you write the way you do, what your thought process is on it. So, going into the point I was making earlier about a lot of action, text blocks, and how a lot of times dialogue seems to be the relief in scripts. Do you have any mindset on, like, when you're writing, about how long text blocks can be, how much white space you need to put onto a page?
Yeah, I think it's been an evolution. I just finished a script solo, but I also, write with Dash a lot. And then I've also been writing something with my buddy Dave. So I think that what happens is I think it's sort of a case by case thing based on the story, to some degree. Like, I think formatting should be a reflection of the type of story that you're telling. Like, I would do something different with, more of a stately paced drama than I would do with like more of a dark comedy thriller or something like that, because there could be some more playfulness actually in the formatting on the latter that might not make sense in the former. But in terms of the white space of it all, I never try to go past 3 lines really with action, maybe 4, but I think that the big thing for me, at least over the last 2 to 3 years, has been I do less and less camera direction writing. I think I still write imagistically, but I'm not doing, again, the angles on, close on, we track over here, we pan over here, zoom in on this, pull out from this. I used to do a lot more of that type of writing, and I think that that's actually kind of more of how these scripts are written in a way.
Definitely.
Which makes sense because it is, a lot of the things that I like to write are more, maybe not dialogue heavy, but they are about dynamics between characters. So a lot of the time you don't need to be quite as image driven in the descriptions. But in this script, I don't think that approach would work at all, because you really need to get the viewer to understand, what we're seeing and get into these moments purely visually.
Why do you think camera directions and scripts throw people off? Is it just because they have to be thinking abstractly on 2 different levels?
I don't think that they throw them off. I think that there's maybe just a taste thing that's changed over time, where there's maybe it's like, continually declining attention spans or something, where like maybe just efficiency has really become the name of the game more than anything. So it's like, how tightly can you write it? And like you were even talking about, like, I think what's so cool and has this confidence in the Coens formatting, for example, right, is that they'll do things that allow them to do something very efficiently, like skipping the character slug once we've established a voice. And they'll literally, between action lines, just do just the dialogue with no slug. But then they'll say, something like, Muldrow gazes by itself, and then they'll have like 3 lines of nothing, and then they'll go to a new slug, because they're almost showing you confidently, like, we want you to linger on this moment. We're going to linger on this. And they use the white space to let you know the pacing, which is great.
You're getting to a point that you and I, when we were working together as director editor, constantly came to a point I constantly made, was that the Coens really, a lot of their career is based on a Hitchcock observation that the easiest way to show what a character is thinking without dialogue is to cut from a character looking and then cut to what the character is looking at.
Yep.
And when you visually show, you establish that where they're looking, the audience knows they're looking at something. And then when you show a point of view shot, or just, it doesn't even do a POV shot. It's just literally just like, this is what they're thinking about.
Exactly. Well, that's also one of the things I did really love in the People's script that was not so present in the Coen script, is the way that they would use. Well, and also they comment on it, which I'm 99% sure would be in the book too. That like they literally say that you're lingering on Muldrow's expression, and we can't understand what the hell he's thinking. Like, he's really clear. Like there's that one moment where he sees a nude Japanese woman showering, and he's looking at her, and they don't, and you know what I mean? And they're like, he's so stone cold that there's no way to perceive what his thoughts are. And they're kind of giving you that, which is interesting, because it's like, it's almost a oxymoronic, because you're getting that moment. You're being told to look at what the character's looking at, but you're also being told that you can't penetrate his thoughts by just looking at his face. So it's almost like a double standard. And I was also going to say, just to finish that thought, what I love with the People's version is they would dance between, Muldrow as a teenager and a young man in Alaska, and then him in this survival mode in Japan, really elegantly by like, he's looking at this and then we're matching back to this. They would weave between these moments, kind of using your eye, like he's looking right, and then you could almost feel the match cuts in the script in a cool way. And I thought that was impressive because, to be in a 2-page scene of him in Japan, and they weave in 2 images, literally 2 single lines about like a lynx hunting some other animal, and then that suddenly like imbues this whole scene with something else, which I think is really hard to pull off well.
I know what I've been trying to do lately in the work is I've been trying to strip down. I realize that a lot of writing, I've been doing tap dances with editorial stuff, and I've been trying to take editorial stuff out of it just because it's hard to picture. And it's one of those things that doesn't matter just because you need to get the blueprint. What you were talking about earlier, the character relationships, interpersonal stuff, that's the stuff that should be on the page. And what's going to come up editorial is going to come up once the movie is made, shot, and in post. Like, that's where like you can come up with the tap dancing. I wanted to get to one of the ways I've been getting around the white space issues lately. Like the last few years, I've been fascinated with Walter Hill's screenwriting. And
I was going to bring up Walter Hill because you talk about, a masculine kind of screenwriter and the tough guy screenwriting of like the 70s and 80s, which I kind of feel like these scripts in a weird way kind of fall into. There is a throwback thing, especially for the late 90s. This is not a late 90s story, obviously, and I think Walter Hill has always been that tough guy filmmaker. I love him for that. What's the Western that he did about Jesse James, the Long Riders? You ever see that?
Yeah. Is that the one where he cast the 3 sets of brothers? Yeah,
that movie's great. I mean, it's also great too because, I mean, anyway, sorry, you brought up Walter, and I agree with that. And that's
no. You were going down an interesting road. My whole point was format. Is that how many Walter Hill, he writes in this haiku style. He writes so many sentence fragments that like, and he doesn't do line breaks, and like you tend to see when a shot doesn't break, but you see the beats moment to moment by shot. And like one of my favorites I read of his is a draft he did of Alien, that like you just see every alien, like you see the movie form out perfectly, and same time, but we're talking like a line of action that's like one word followed by the next line is 2 words, followed by the next line is 1 word. And
it's very non-fussy. It's non-fussy screenwriting.
He seemed, I found the quote, he got a lot of his style from one of his favorite scripts that he learned from was Alexander Jacobs' draft of Point Blank. And the quote I have from him is I've been making a living as a screenwriter for maybe 2 or 3 years, and I had gotten to the point where I was dissatisfied with the standard form scripts were written in. They all just seemed to be a kind of sub-literary blueprint for shooting a picture and generally had no personal voice. Mine were tighter and terser than the average, but I was still working with the industry template and not too happy about it. Alex's script just knocked me out, not easy to do. It was both playable and literary, written in a whole different way than standard format, laconic, elliptical, suggestive rather than explicit, bold in the implied editorial style. I thought Alexander's script was a perfect complement to the material, hard, tough, and smart. My absolute ideas then.
I love that, and I love Point Blank too. I mean, I think Lee Marvin is such a badass in that movie.
But it's it's such an editorial movie, but like I can't imagine that on the page. It's like the Hiroshima Manamore script doesn't show that editorial style on it at all.
Yeah, no, it's a really good comparison, and I mean, I would love to read that script if you ever find that '67 version, or if you have it.
I actually am reading from a screenplay off of Cinephilia and Beyond Tumblr where they'll have a link to it. I'll send to you. But
Yeah, dude, send it to me. No, I love that, and I am trying to capture that more too. Where I think that there's a thin line, right, where you're doing something here, like with this, with To the White Sea, is it's like it's period, and there's a lot of detail, and they'll take details, and like early on when he's taping up the parachute, or they explain the bread knife, or there's like these kind of details about his clothing and kind of like some of those textures, but a lot of the time less is more, I think, especially when you have all this very heavy action kind of stuff. You don't want to get lost in literary description, and I think in both of these scripts they did kind of a nice balance of not getting bogged down in that.
yeah, the trick on all this is like this is a great writer who wrote very few novels, who has two amazing screenwriters, pairs of screenwriters, do an amazing job at at writing out a very nonverbal piece at the end of the day.
Yep, exactly. Well, and that's why I do kind of want to finish the book, because I think it would be interesting to see
Yeah.
structurally where liberties were taken between the two of them, because I have a feeling that the Coens version is kind of a little bit more like they probably cut out. I think what they did is they're probably more faithful to the book in the sections that they chose, but I think that they cut out more from it. In the People's version, I feel like they were trying to capture a lot of the book, and that's why there's a lot of back and forth, and there's things where you're like, oh, this probably reflection on his childhood or this hunting experience being folded into this feels like it probably was there.
I think the model here, though, is that the Coens really have done very few adaptations. They've rewritten other scripts, but like the two main literary adaptations they've done were No Country for Old Men and True Grit with Charles Portis, and both they worked with writers who were very poetic, chiseled prose stylists, which also plays with Dickey. And I kind of wanted to go into a little of so. Uh, Ethan Coen, have you read any of his published stuff? He has a short story collection called Gates of Eden, and he's written some poetry.
No, I know about it. I heard about Gates of Eden, but no, I haven't read that, and I would
Well,
love to.
when you read these, there is like Joel Coen is doing the Macbeth adaptation right now,
Right,
and Ethan
exactly.
Coen isn't. It makes me wonder if Ethan is more the writer and Joel's more the visual guy, or if whether the personality distinction needs to be made. But
I've always thought that. I mean, I definitely think Ethan's more of, I mean, that's always been their balance. And even though we all know that, like, they kind of co-directed a lot of those early films, I mean, Joel always got the directing credit. Ethan usually got the writing credit.
they used to make the big deal about the Directors Guild made them separated, but then they always said we were directing together, and only recently have they. Or I guess that's why I was weirded out by the Macbeth thing, because I thought they had like delineated, like no one had a difference between roles at a certain point. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think from interviews and stuff I've seen and knowing Joel's, editorial background as well, I feel like, Joel is more the directorial editorial mind, and I think that Ethan's more of a straight screenwriter. That's the impression I get, but I don't really know.
I think the dialogue in all these movies, I think in To the White Sea, the unmade movie, but in No Country and in True Grit, comes from a very place of chiseled poetry. I have Ethan's collection, The Drunken Driver Has the Right of Way. Do you want me to go to a random page and read an excerpt?
Yes, please.
Okay, we're going to page 32. The title of this poem is I Love You Deeply, Darling, and let's just pick a random one. So if, given that all me's would have, my present attitude, these subjunctives are indicative, I'll never change my mood.
That's very elliptical and and dense as hell.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that gives you an indicator right there of his inclinations. Solo.
When I tried it earlier, I found a page that I was like that seems like a piece of Coen Brothers dialogue when I did it earlier.
Well, that's what I feel like they probably fell in. Like when you see, I think that's a good, again, specific comparison between the two drafts. When you see how much of that early the Colonels, when we're going to bring the fire down on him, we're going to put it up his asshole and we're going to put it in his wife's twat and we're going to bring it down through his fucking earlobe. Like they kept almost all of that dialogue from the book. They kept almost every word of it. Whereas the People's version, very much whittled it down to a couple of the key kind of takeaways of it. And I think that I imagine that some of the way that Dickey writes language is what they probably fell in love with as much as the story itself, I feel like.
One passage I definitely tried to read was I tried to read the last few pages and I tried to compare the ends of the book, ends of the two scripts versus the book. And the one version that worked more than anything was the Coen Brothers. Like the Coen Brothers, there's something about, I've had a spiel against the Coen Brothers work in general that there's very few instances where like you've heard the accusation that they're cold filmmakers, or they can tend to be like sometimes they may be a little too cruel to their characters.
Yeah, they're not very sympathetic to their character. They are cruel gods, and I do think that is fair.
There's also this really great article that from the Fallen Birth Movies Death website where they take I forget, there's a monologue in the last chapter of Ballad of Buster Scruggs, that the anthology movie on Netflix. There's a monologue in the last chapter of that's supposedly the entire Coen Brothers ethos. You should look at that article. I wish I had it in front of me right now, otherwise I wouldn't be pushing there. But my favorite Coen Brothers passages throughout their filmography are the few times I feel like they really care about their characters. And like the ones I always think of are like the very end of Raising Arizona, where what's his face? The Nicolas Cage character imagines his future. One of the reasons I rewatched Inside Llewellyn Davis the other night, and one of the reasons I think that movie works despite being such a hard movie, is that you get that opening scene with Oscar Isaacs playing If I Had Wings. I think he starts out with If I Had Wings.
Yeah.
I think is that the song he starts out with? Anyway, it's just so beautiful, and it's just such as evocative of a inner soul he's singing throughout. And there's something about the end of their version of To the White Sea, because going back to my earlier worry structurally about why does this story not work when it's all been about Muldoon not dying and then he dies. Well, the Coens nail it just because there's this great, beautiful metaphysical passage. Like there's that point of like the voiceover even has this meta moment where it's like, this is how you can hear me talking to you because I'm in the ether, I'm in the metaphysic, I'm in this spiritual realm, and that's how you're hearing me talk to you in the snow. And
Exactly. I totally agree. And I was going to say, I think what's so nice about that they do too is like, here's this on page 3, is when I tell you this, just say it came from a voice in the wind, a voice without a voice, which doesn't make a sound. You can pick it up any time it snows, or even just when the wind is from the north. And that's the way, and it's sort of like the movie has this nice book ending kind of coming to it. Is it sort of like there is like this kind of, when you are part of nature and you are one with everything, like there's even a sense that he's not so much, he hates Japanese in this story, but he's not so much doing it vengefully. He even has that moment of respect with the former samurai, the guy, that he gets to drop on.
The blind man, that sequence in all versions is so cool.
That might be the best sequence in the movie, but he has this kind of respect for him. And there's this, and there's this sense that we kind of, everything comes from dust, goes back to dust. We're all part of the universe. We're all forged in the same particles and kind of all of that. There is this sense that there is no, beginning and end, which is why I think you could pull this movie off without him needing to survive. I mean, normally that would be very unsatisfying.
Just the passage you read, that is just, it's a really beautiful passage.
Yeah, but just to your point, I just remember because that's on page 3, and it literally is a book ending. You know what I mean? Because they just kind of weave that in, and then you get this, and it's also what I think is so cool about probably the book in general, but just this story, and a lot of, if you look at Deliverance, or you look at, any kind of survival story, it's the juxtaposition of things that are so ugly with things that are so beautiful. It's like there's some of the images and him in nature and some of the these solitary moments he has where that are just incredibly poetic and beautiful. And then he's got like these ridiculously cutthroat, violent moments that are kind of hard to stomach, you know?
I want to start winding down, although I'm winding down with a very big topic to bite off. You and I have had these conversations before. I think you know how I feel about this, but I hate the screenwriting format so goddamn much. Like, I just think that, like, I think there's a reason this movie hadn't gotten made, even though it was expensive and everyone complains about the being expensive. But I don't know if my unreadability translated to others, but I got a feeling it did. Like, I got a feeling a lot of people didn't get through this script.
That it was too dense, and that was part of the reason it never made it. Is that what you mean?
I think so.
I think
yeah.
That's probably right. You know what? When you said that, too, though, it did remind me a little bit of, like, 1917, right? You know, I mean, you can make a war film that is very, like, it can be done, but I think you're probably right that at the time, especially given the
With 1917, you know, on a linear scale, you know the time that's happening. You don't have to constantly concentrate between the difference between night and day. You don't have to look at a new scene and wondering what's the setting, because filmmakers are going to granularly come out from a shot of, like, the Coen Brothers version always ends with a fade out, fade up of when he finally goes to sleep, right? And it fades up, it's going to granularly come out from where is he at, and then subjectively reveal the scene around him as he discovers it. And there's always going to be a part of your brain that has to figure that out, whereas 1917... you just know we're going straight through.
It's a real time. Yeah, it's real time. Yeah. No, I think that's probably true. But the other thing, too, between the two, and this is a format thing, I guess my opinion is yes, I think you're probably right. I do think that readability is really important, and there might have been something where, you know, it was hard to get enough momentum behind it because it's dense. But also... there's no slugs in the Coen version, really. You know, to speak of.
There really isn't. There really isn't.
Which makes it tricky, and that's always something I've tried to do. Like, Dash and I are actually working on this new thing, and we have a montage kind of format we'll do at 3 or 4 sections in the movie where we abandon slugs, and we try to do more of a, you know, the locations are existing within the action lines, and it's a tricky balance. You know, I've always tried to do that. Or if you see, like, you know, Tony Gilroy scripts, you know, or whatever, like, it can be done really well. But it's fucking intimidating. And if you're like a development person and you're probably reading 20 scripts a week, and then one shows up and it's a 100-page scroll without a single scene slug in it, that is a denser, more intimidating read. So
I'm buying off this. I want to know if you have any thoughts about are we going to stay with the screenwriting format forever, or are we going to change it? I think of things like the Fury Road script, which supposedly there was a script on it, but I mean, famously they sold it, a highly visual movie with a storyboard script. And I think of, like, I re-looked it up. The format that we currently go with is pretty consistent with, there's been benchmarks where it's changed, like, I think a lot of people kind of point to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as a big moment where screenwriting changed. But a lot of it has stayed the same since Thomas Inch in the, like, 1910s. And he was a rival of D.W. Griffith, who, like, all of his silence were being shot off of, like, these one-page treatments. And Inch, like, Griffith and him had a rivalry, but they didn't respect him as a director. Inch was a businessman who, like, started the assembly line. And he was the one that was, like, figured out a movie need to be a page a minute. He had this phase that whenever he was happy with what exactly happened, with details to department heads on the page of who's going to what and everything, and exactly what's going to happen moment to moment, he would then stamp on it this thing that says, produce exactly as written. And screenplays have mostly stayed the same. Like, you mentioned the slug line. The slug line is so bizarre because the key thing in the slug line is you need to tell if we're shooting in a studio or if we're shooting on location, exterior, interior.
It lets you know, right, exactly. That makes perfect sense. And it's also, I think, the reason it makes for so much more easy readability, obviously, is it allows you to just have your eyes drift over the page without ever losing track of time of day or setting, which if you don't have slugs, it becomes, you have to be reading more diligently. It's almost like a test for the reader or something that's requiring to make sure that you're paying attention more. Versus...
Isn't that more familiarity with the format versus like, because the thing is, don't you remember how intimidating a script was when you first tried to read your very first screenplays?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably right. I think it's a familiarity thing, but I think even once you're familiar, I think that there are, like back to your point, I think that there probably is something about the nature of this story that, made it a denser read and might have had something to do with how much momentum could be built behind it, or might have had a reason why it never made it to production, those things. But that's interesting. And back to your larger question, I mean, that is a big question. I think that, also I've talked to a friend, again, my buddy Dave. I mean, we were even talking about, putting decks together and stuff. And I just had to do a deck for a pitch. And
are decks more popular during COVID?
Probably. I mean, I think that's interesting, and I think decks are more shareable too. But like the decks that I do are very, very low to no text at all, or I mean, literally maybe nothing. And so I think that maybe somewhat of a more graphic novel kind of pitch deck where there is a bit of a balance between the two. I could see that. And we both work for Malik, and I mean, he got all of his movies financed off a 15-page Word document of a treatment, but most of us aren't going to pull that one off.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of that's also he's basing that off of proof of career and proof of concept. Like he's made it
of course,
before, so
of course. But I mean, I do think that it's also like back to your point. It's kind of about what's the appetite for reading sometimes, because I think that is the thing. Is it's like I'm not sure that the screenplay is always the best way to put forward. To get somebody interested or get them to understand what the vibe of something is.
Do you think screenplays are designed are they blueprints for a finished movie? Are they to sell financiers? Are they to get actors on board? Are they to just give you your department heads and your technicians an idea of what you're going to do? Or are they some kind of combination, but imperfect combination of all those?
I think it's a combination, but I do think the thing that stuck out to me most there is department heads and actors. Like to me, it mostly is if directing is anything, it's communicating a vision in a way that people can come along and help you have a unified consensus about where we're all going. So if the script can do that, I think that's kind of the number one. But now where I'm at career-wise, I mean, absolutely, I look at, the script is there to get an actor. Because if it was purely a blueprint for me, I wonder maybe I would write certain things more differently. I think, like when I wrote Inheritance or even with Stalker, I think that there is more of a blueprint kind of feel to it versus now the last couple of years I've been kind of leaning away from that a little bit and feeling like it's really more about the vision and the point of view of the writing than it is about having every image be clear on the page. You know what I mean? And I think so it to me it's a lot about, clarity and getting people to come along with you. But, like Tarantino always says, it's like the script should be something I would just, like he did with Once Upon a Time, I could just publish and it would be great by itself. Because I think,
See, that's the hold up. I felt like I've found a lot of my friends, I've occasionally gotten held up on it, but I know a lot of friends just like the literary quality of a screenplay. Like, in theory, a script should never be published. It should.
I agree. I was going to say I don't agree with that point of view. I think that a script is not. It's an incomplete thing. It's not. You know what I mean? But at the same time, it needs to convey enough of the essence of what you're trying to do that people get on board with it and are excited by it and can rally around it. But it in and of itself, it's inherently incomplete.
I mean, I may just be coming from a place of constant dissatisfaction of like I want my movies to be more visual or more literary, and I want like I want more people or more financiers to put more money into complex movies, and I'm mad at them for not what they spend their money on. Like, cause when I was reading this, I kept thinking of the concept that, like, in theory, a script reads like a movie, in theory, you should be reading a page a minute if you're following the minute rule. And, like, these scripts definitely do not work that way.
No, they don't. And I remember there's this funny quote from... I think it's from, I can't remember. I think it's from Jim Jarmusch. And I think he was talking in some interview, like on a Criterion interview or something, about how silly he thought that, that 1 minute a page rule was, because it was just like, I could literally be like, for example, with this, the bombing of Tokyo, and, from overhead, we witnessed the bombing of Tokyo. According to that logic, that should be, 3 seconds, on the page.
What is it? Would that be like 1/16 of a page? So
Right, exactly. You know what I mean? So I think that logic is silly. And I think what you're seeing more, like, I've been reading some, blacklist scripts, I'm always trying to, like, read some new stuff just to see what people are doing. And I think people are challenging format a little bit, and you see more. But also I think they're doing it sometimes in a way where I feel like it's a bit of, like, a novelty. You know what I mean? Where it's sort of like, we're doing some fun formatting, crazy, wacky stuff. I'm going to put my margin over here, and then I'm going to center all this, and
you're getting to my worry that the real thing of the novelty in a script is supposed to appeal to is not to a blueprint, not to anything that's ever going to see a finished movie. It's just to the fucking agencies. It's just to the gatekeepers.
Exactly. And it's this weird homogenized, incestuous kind of system, right? Where it's sort of like, it's all... that's why people should be reading things that aren't screenplays too. You know what I mean? Because I think that what happens is everybody's trying, and there's also like the spec sale game in the development world. I have a lot of critical opinions about it, and I think there's a reason a lot of those movies don't make it to production. They're made to be sexy to read and appealing, and that kind of game in and of itself is its own end game. It's not meant to necessarily always have these things ramped to production, because we know that even like on that, the blacklist, there's 100 scripts there, and probably 8 of them will get made, and those are supposed to be like the creme de la creme of what was made, written last year.
Well, speaking of the blacklist, it always comes with a perfect example I bring up all the time. I don't remember what year it was. I was like 2008, but do you remember that Angelina Jolie movie Salt?
Yes.
Do you remember when it was on the blacklist?
Sure.
When the character was still a man, and like I remember the first 2 pages were like the funnest thing, one of the funnest things I've ever read, and like it just opened with like dialogue scene where these 2 people bickered, repeating the same line over and over for 2 pages, and it was such a fun opening. And that movie is, I'm surprised you remembered it. It's a very forgettable movie.
It is, yeah, and I like Philip Noyce. I mean, he's made some good movies, but that movie
of course.
I
don't want to. Philip Noyce is a great filmmaker. I don't want to.
But that movie's very forgettable, because I think there's also, the fact of the matter is that there is always a component of this game that's magic, and I think that that's what's fun. But I think that a lot of what happens in development is it's we're working off of what is data driven and what is familiar, and trying to, I think that also what happens is everybody tries to recreate lightning in a bottle, and you'll see like some new trend, and then everybody hops on that bandwagon, and it's sort of like that's how things get overly saturated and stories get, again, more homogenous and less interesting, because it's almost like everybody's looking over, at their neighboring desks and being like, oh, well, what are they doing? Should I do something more like that? And then suddenly everybody's kind of trying to do the same thing.
No, I think you nailed it. Do you have any last thoughts?
No, this was great. And thanks again. And it was really fun to be able to, again, read these things. And I think that, I think this is a great thing to do on a podcast, because I think, sadly, this movie never will be made. I would be very surprised if it ever was. But
I'm really curious, like, based on the Vertigo movies, what else, like, I would love for them to make this. And I would love for them to make a very commercially accessible version of this, just because there's so much hard edge inherently built into the subject. So
I think that's and I do think that could happen. Like we were saying about, there is still that appetite for those stories, and I think if you do, I think there is a good way to do it. I just think that because you said it is quite dense, and it is not an affordable movie to make. It's like the likelihood of it making, I can see why it never quite made it there, even with all these amazingly talented people involved and all these attachments and all these things. There's also, I don't know, maybe The Revenant killed it a little bit now too. I don't know, like, would Brad want to go do that after? Like, there's just something about where...
Well, the Coens have said that he's too old for this, so they'd have to find somebody else by this point.
Well, now they would. I mean, the guy is supposed to be like 22. Or something.
Yeah. So, I did have these moments reading the script where it's just like, I have my own Coen Brothers movie right here that very few people are aware of. There's that, but it's not an actualized Coen Brothers movie. So,
yeah.
Tyler Savage, thank you so much for being on the podcast. You will definitely be back.
Anytime. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Shane.
Thanks, bud.